Look at your last paycheck, not the number at the bottom, the one at the top, the one labeled gross pay. That's how much you actually earned. Now look at the number you took home. The gap between those two figures, that space between what you made and what you received, is the most successful disappearing act in the history of modern government. Every 2 weeks, somewhere between a quarter and a third of your income vanishes before you touch it. Federal income tax, state income tax, Social Security, Medicare, line after line, deduction after deduction, each one removing a slice of what you earned before the remainder arrives in your bank account. You've been watching this happen your entire working life. You've never once received a bill for the total, never once written a check to the government for the full amount, never once had to sit down, open your wallet, and decide, in a single, painful, fully conscious moment, to hand that money over. You've never felt the tax. You've only felt the absence of money you were told was never yours to begin with. That's not an accident. That's not convenience. That's the design. Before 1943, Americans paid their income taxes the way you pay your rent, in one lump sum, once a year, with full awareness of every dollar leaving their hands. The system that replaced it was built during a world war, engineered by a department store executive, promoted by a cartoon duck, and implemented with the help of a young economist who would spend the rest of his life wishing he hadn't. It was supposed to be temporary. 80 years later, it's the reason you've never truly felt the weight of what your government costs. 2. When Americans wrote a check for the first 150 years of the United States, the federal government barely taxed its citizens at all. There was no permanent income tax until 1913, when the 16th Amendment was ratified. Even then, the tax applied to almost nobody. In 1939, just 4 years before withholding began, fewer than 4 million Americans filed a federal income tax return. The total amount collected was roughly $1 billion. The income tax was a class tax, not a mass tax. It touched the wealthy and left everyone else alone. Those few million who did owe taxes experienced payment as a deliberate conscience, as a poetic conscious act. Once a year, they sat down, calculated what they owed, and wrote a check to the government. They felt every dollar. They argued about every dollar. They knew to the cent what their government cost them because the money was already theirs, sitting in their bank account, and they had to make the decision to hand it over. The process was inconvenient. It was sometimes painful. For some, it was infuriating. But it had one quality that the system replacing it would deliberately erase: transparency. When you write a check, you know exactly what you're paying. You compare it to what you received. You form judgments about whether the price was worth it. You carry that judgment into the voting booth. That friction between citizen and state, the annual reckoning, the lump sum that sat on the kitchen table demanding attention, was about to be engineered out of the relationship entirely. Not because it was broken, but because it was inconvenient for a government that was about to need vastly more money than it had ever collected before. 3. A war that couldn't wait for April. On December 7, 1941, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, and the United States entered a war it could not fight on credit alone. In 1940, the federal government had spent $9 billion. By 1945, it would spend more than $90 billion, a tenfold increase in 5 years. Shipyards were building vessels around the clock. Aircraft factories were turning out planes at a rate that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. The Manhattan Project alone would consume $2 billion in secret. The country needed money, not once a year in April, but constantly, every week, in enormous and growing quantities that no previous American government had ever attempted to collect. The problem was arithmetic. Congress had already passed the Revenue Act of 1942, which slashed the income threshold so dramatically that the tax base exploded. Before the war, roughly 5% of American workers paid income tax. The Revenue Act slashed the personal exemption for single filers from $750 to $500 and imposed a new victory tax with an exemption of just $624, low enough to sweep in factory workers, secretaries, truck drivers, and store clerks who had never owed a cent to the IRS. After the act, approximately 75% of American workers would owe income tax. The number kept climbing. By 1945, 50 million individual returns were being filed, up from fewer than 4 million just 6 years earlier. And they owed more than $19 billion, roughly 20 times what the government had collected in 1939. The income tax had transformed overnight from something that affected a small slice of the wealthy into a mass obligation that reached almost every working person in the country. But there was a catch. These tens of millions of new taxpayers had never paid income tax before. They had no savings set aside for it. They had no habit of budgeting for it. Asking 46 million first-time taxpayers to calculate what they owed and write a large check every March would have been an administrative catastrophe and a political one. The Treasury knew it. If millions of Americans suddenly received a tax bill they couldn't afford, the backlash would be immediate and severe. They needed a way to collect the money without anyone feeling it. The question wasn't whether to tax the population. That decision was already made. The question was how to make tens of millions of first-time taxpayers surrender a significant portion of their income without revolt. The answer, when it arrived, was elegant, psychological, and permanent. 4. The department store executive and the economist. The solution came from an unlikely pair. Beardsley Rummel was the treasurer of R.H. Macy & Company, one of the largest department stores in the country, and simultaneously the chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. He understood consumer psychology the way few government officials did. He knew that the pain of payment is concentrated in the moment of decision, the instant you open your wallet and hand the money over. Spread that moment thin enough, and the pain nearly vanishes. In 1942, Rummel published a proposal he called pay-as-you-go taxation. The idea was deceptively simple. Instead of letting workers accumulate a year's worth of tax liability and then asking them to settle the bill in one painful lump, the government would take the money out of every paycheck automatically, before the worker ever saw it. The employer would do the collecting, unpaid, compelled by law, transformed from a private business into a government revenue agent. The worker would receive what was left. The full amount earned would still appear on the pay stub, technically visible, but the number that mattered, the one deposited into the bank account, the one the worker would use to pay rent and buy groceries and plan a life, would already be reduced. The tax would be paid continuously, invisibly, without any single moment of sacrifice. Rummel understood something profound about human psychology, something his years in retail had taught him. People don't react to abstractions. They react to experiences. A number on a page is an abstraction. A check you have to write is an experience. Remove the experience, and the number loses its power to provoke. The worker still pays the same amount, but they never feel the payment. Rummel's proposal ignited a fierce debate in Congress. Some legislators recognized exactly what was happening, that the government was building a machine to collect money so smoothly that citizens would stop paying attention to how much was being taken. Others saw the practical necessity. A war doesn't wait for annual tax checks to clear. The debate over the transition mechanism, how to forgive the previous year's taxes while switching to the new system, consumed months of legislative energy. Meanwhile, inside the Treasury Department's Tax Research Division, a young economist named Milton Friedman was solving the mechanical problem. He was part of a small technical group tasked with designing how withholding would actually work, what to deduct, when to deduct it, how employers would calculate the amounts, how to account for varying income levels and family sizes. The IRS initially said it was impossible to implement, that hundreds of thousands of employers couldn't be turned into tax collectors overnight, that the paperwork alone would paralyze American business. Friedman and his colleagues proved otherwise. They built the system that would become the backbone of American tax collection for the next 8 decades. Decades later, Friedman, by then the most famous free market economist in the world, reflected on what he'd helped create. "I think it's a great mistake for peacetime," he said. "But in 1941 to 1943, all of us were concentrating on the war. I have no apologies for it, but I really wish we hadn't found it necessary. And I wish there were some way of abolishing withholding now." He couldn't abolish it. Nobody could. The machine he helped build had become permanent, not because anyone voted to keep it, not because a national debate concluded it was the best system, but because it worked too well to dismantle. Once a government learns to collect money invisibly, it doesn't volunteer to make the process visible again. The architecture of painless extraction once built becomes its own justification for continuing. Five at a duck sells the idea. The government still had one problem. Even with a mechanism in place, it needed the public to accept the new system without resistance. 46 million people who had never paid income tax were about to see money vanishing from their paychecks for the first time. They needed to be persuaded. Not just that this was necessary, but that it was patriotic. That it was their duty. That refusing would be unpatriotic. So the Treasury turned to Hollywood. In January 1942, Secretary of the Treasury Henry Morgenthau Jr. personally commissioned Walt Disney to make a short film. The result was called The New Spirit, and it starred the most recognizable cartoon character in America, Donald Duck. In the film, Donald hears about the war effort on the radio, learns that his taxes will fund planes, ships, and guns, and rushes to file his return. The film played in theaters across the country. More than 60 million Americans watched it, in an era when the entire U.S. population was around 130 million. The impact was measurable. The Revenue Act had already expanded the tax base enormously, but compliance was the concern. Would tens of millions of new taxpayers actually file? The New Spirit helped answer that question. Tax filing surged, and taxes were paid more promptly in 1942 than in any prior year. Time magazine called the film a most effective job, noting it delivered propaganda with the anesthetic blessing of laughter. The Treasury asked Congress for $80,000 to cover the production costs. Congress refused. They funded it through other channels anyway. A cartoon duck. That was the vehicle the United States government chose to introduce the largest fiscal transformation in American history to its citizens. And it worked. Not because Americans were naive, but because the film did something no policy paper or congressional speech could accomplish. It turned tax payment into a narrative of personal heroism. Donald wasn't calculating deductions. He was fighting the war from his living room. The message was brilliant in its simplicity. Paying taxes isn't something the government does to you. It's something you do for your country. The obligation became a virtue. The sacrifice became a privilege. If you find it strange that the United States government used a cartoon duck to sell a tax system to its citizens, consider that the system they were selling would go on to collect trillions of dollars over the next 80 years. The duck may have been the single most effective piece of financial communication in American history. 6. The law that made it permanent. On June 9, 1943, President Franklin Roosevelt signed the Current Tax Payment Act into law. With a stroke of a pen, payroll withholding became the standard method of collecting income tax in the United States. The employer became the government's unpaid tax collector. The pay stub became the ledger. And the worker, for the first time in American history, would receive a paycheck that had already been reduced by the government's share before it arrived. To smooth the transition from the old system, where taxes were paid on the previous year's income, the act included a complicated forgiveness provision. It canceled 1 year's tax obligations of $50 or less and forgave 75% of the required tax on the lower of 1942 or 1943 income. The remaining balance was due in 2 installments. Charlotte Twite, a political economist who studied the legislative history of withholding in detail, documented something remarkable about how the law was sold. In her research published through the Cato Institute, Twite found that proponents of withholding systematically misrepresented its workings, its consequences, and the government's reasons for seeking it. The tax cancellation offered during the transition was, she wrote, a sham, and was understood to be a sham by a significant number of government officials. The forgiveness wasn't generosity. It was the price of getting the public to accept a permanent change in how their money was collected. The Treasury itself acknowledged what withholding accomplished beyond revenue collection. As the economist George Lent observed, the system ensured that the taxpayer does not have the same consciousness of parting with his income to the government. That wasn't a side effect. It was the point. Within 2 years, the new system was collecting staggering sums. Withholding produced approximately $8 billion in 1944 and over $10 billion in 1945. From a country that had collected less than $1 billion in total individual income tax just 6 years earlier. The numbers tell the story of a machine that worked precisely as designed. In 1939, the government collected a modest tax from a small number of wealthy citizens who wrote checks once a year. By 1945, it was extracting 10 times as much from 50 million workers who never wrote a check at all. The revenue had exploded. The resistance had not. That asymmetry was the system's greatest achievement and its most revealing feature. 7. The psychology of invisible money. There's a distinction here that seems obvious but isn't. There is a fundamental difference between paying a tax and having a tax taken from you. The first is an action. You decide, you calculate, you transfer. The second is an absence. Something is missing from your check, and you accept the smaller number because it's the only number you've ever known. When you write a check, you feel the money leave. When money is withheld, you feel nothing because you never had it. The paycheck you receive already reflects the deduction. Your budget starts from the net number. Your sense of what you earn is shaped not by what you made, but by what arrived. This is not a minor psychological distinction. It changes how citizens relate to their government spending. Before withholding, every taxpayer felt the full cost of government once a year, in a single concentrated moment. After withholding, that cost was distributed across 26 paychecks, buried inside a pay stub most people glance at for 2 seconds, expressed not as a bill to be paid but as a line already deducted. Economists and behavioral scientists have studied this effect for decades. The phenomenon has a name: fiscal illusion, a term coined by the Italian economist Amilcare Puviani in 1903, 4 decades before the American withholding system proved his theory on a national scale. When the cost of government is hidden, embedded in prices, deducted from pay, collected through mechanisms that reduce the perception of payment, citizens systematically underestimate what they're paying. They support higher levels of government spending than they would if they wrote a check for the full amount every year. The friction that once existed between citizen and state, the annual reckoning, the painful lump sum, was engineered away. Look at the numbers on a typical paycheck today. Federal income tax takes its cut first. The percentage depends on your bracket, but for a median income earner, it's substantial. Then state income tax, in the 43 states that impose 1. Then Social Security at 6.2% of your gross pay. Then Medicare at 1.45%. Your employer pays a matching 6.2% for Social Security and 1.45% for Medicare on top of your salary. Money that is functionally part of your compensation but never appears on your pay stub. You've never seen it. You've never counted it. It's part of the invisible architecture. Add it all up for a median income worker, and the total effective bite, the sum of everything visible and invisible, federal and state, regularly lands between 25 and 35% of gross pay. For higher earners, it climbs further. Over a 40-year career, these deductions compound into hundreds of thousands of dollars, money that was earned by your labor, assigned to your name, and removed before you could decide what to do with it. Now ask yourself, if you had to write one check every year for the full amount, if you had to sit down on April 15th and physically transfer tens of thousands of dollars from your savings to the federal government, would your relationship with taxation feel different? This isn't hypothetical. Self-employed workers, freelancers, small business owners, independent contractors live in this reality every quarter. They calculate their estimated taxes, write the check, and feel the full weight of the number. Ask any of them whether they think about government spending differently than their salaried neighbors. The answer is almost universally yes. When you write the check, the cost is real. When someone else deducts it before you see the money, the cost is theoretical. A number on a stub you glance at once and file away. And there's one more layer to the illusion, perhaps the most revealing one. Every spring, millions of Americans file their tax returns and celebrate when they receive a refund. A check arrives from the IRS, or a deposit appears in the bank account, and there's a small rush of pleasure. Free money, a windfall. Except it isn't. A tax refund is not a gift from the government. It is your own money being returned to you. Money that was taken from your paychecks throughout the year in excess of what you actually owed. The government held it for months. It earned interest on the aggregate. Then it gave it back to you without interest, and you felt grateful. You thanked the system for returning what it had overtaken. The average federal refund typically lands between $3,000 and $4,000. $3,000 per household that the government borrowed from working Americans, interest-free for 6 to 8 months. The withholding system is so psychologically effective that it turned an overpayment, a mistake in the government's favor, into something Americans look forward to. The architects of withholding knew all of this. That's why they built the system they built. 8. What temporary means in government. The withholding system was introduced as a wartime emergency measure. The war ended in 1945. The measure didn't. Not only did withholding survive the end of World War II, it became the foundation on which every subsequent expansion of the tax system was built. Social Security payroll taxes had already begun in 1937, deducted at the source from the very beginning. So the architecture of automatic extraction was already partially in place when income tax withholding arrived 6 years later. Medicare followed in 1965, slotted neatly into the same payroll deduction structure. State income taxes, which most states didn't impose until the mid-20th century, adopted the federal withholding model almost universally when they did appear. By the 1970s, the typical American worker's pay stub had become a small ledger of government claims, each one deducted silently, each one accepted as a fact of employment rather than a policy choice. Each new layer was painless to add because the architecture was already in place. The employer was already acting as tax collector. The pay stub already had room for another line. The worker was already accustomed to receiving less than they earned. No march on Washington, no taxpayer rebellion. Just one more deduction on a document most people filed without reading. This is the deeper legacy of the 1943 decision. It didn't just create a mechanism for collecting income tax. It created a template, a proven method for extracting revenue from a population without triggering resistance. Once the template existed, every subsequent expansion of government revenue followed the same logic. Take it before they see it. Make it automatic. Ensure that the worker's mental model of my income starts from the net number, not the gross. By 2005, 71% of all federal income tax revenue, $787 billion out of $1.1 trillion, came from withholding, not from checks written in April, not from quarterly estimated payments, from money deducted before it reached the worker. The system Beardsley Rumell proposed and Milton Friedman helped engineer had become the single largest revenue collection mechanism on the planet. The phrase "nothing is so permanent as a temporary government program" is often attributed to Friedman himself. Whether he said it or not, he lived the proof, and the pattern extends beyond the United States. Nearly every developed nation on Earth now uses payroll withholding. The UK introduced pay-as-you-earn in 1944, just 1 year after the American version. Australia, Canada, Germany, Japan. The model spread across the post-war world because every government that encountered it recognized the same thing the U.S. Treasury had discovered: invisible collection works. Citizens who never hold the money rarely fight to keep it. The withholding system Beardsley Rumell proposed and Milton Friedman helped engineer as a wartime expedient in 1943 is still collecting your taxes today. Every paycheck, every 2 weeks, with the same invisible efficiency it was designed to have 80 years ago. 9. The gap between what you earn and what you keep. Step back and trace the full picture. You earn a salary. Before you see it, your employer deducts federal income tax, state income tax, Social Security, and Medicare. Your employer also pays a matching amount of Social Security and Medicare on your behalf, money that is part of your total compensation but never appears on your check. When you spend what's left, you pay sales tax. When you buy property, you pay property tax. When you invest and earn a return, you pay capital gains tax. When you die, your estate may pay an inheritance tax. At no point in this chain were you asked to sit down and consciously decide to pay. At no point were you presented with a total and asked whether you agreed. Every mechanism was designed to collect without confrontation, to take the money at the moment of earning, the moment of spending, the moment of investing, and the moment of dying. Each extraction embedded so seamlessly into the transaction that resistance doesn't occur to most people. The income tax withholding system of 1943 was the template, the proof of concept that showed governments how to fund themselves without their citizens ever fully reckoning with the cost. This is not an argument against taxation. Roads get built, schools get staffed, armies get funded. Societies need revenue, and the question of how much is a legitimate debate with reasonable positions on every side. But that debate, the one about how much, is shaped by whether citizens can feel what they're paying. And the system that was built in 1943 was designed explicitly, deliberately, by people who said so in their own documents. To make sure you didn't, there is a version of this system where your full salary arrives in your bank account every 2 weeks, and once a month you write a check to the government for your share. It would collect the same revenue, fund the same programs, build the same roads. The only difference is that you would feel it, you would know. And the architects of withholding understood in 1943 that a citizenry that feels its taxes behaves very differently from one that doesn't. 10. The check you never write. Think about what existed before June 1943. An American worker knew exactly what the government cost. The number arrived once a year, in full, undeniable. It sat on the kitchen table and demanded attention. The worker paid it, resented it, debated it with neighbors, and voted with that number fresh in mind. Then the Current Tax Payment Act took effect, and the number dissolved. It was still there, larger than ever, in fact. But it had been broken into pieces so small and so frequent that no single deduction triggered the reflex of resistance. The money was gone before it arrived. The worker adjusted. The budget started from net, not gross. The gap between earning and receiving became normal. So normal that most people alive today have never experienced anything else. A wartime measure. A department store executive who understood that people don't miss what they never hold. A young economist who built the machinery and spent decades regretting it. A cartoon duck who made it feel patriotic. And a law signed on a June afternoon in 1943 that was supposed to last until the war ended. The war ended in 1945. The tanks came home. The factories converted back to civilian production. The soldiers returned to their families. The emergency was over. But the withholding system, the one piece of wartime machinery that was supposed to be temporary, kept running. It kept running through the Korean War and the Cold War and Vietnam and every decade since. It kept running because no politician would propose giving citizens back the experience of paying their taxes in full, in person, once a year. The system that was built to fund a war became the system that funds everything. And the citizens who live inside it have never known anything else. Your money is still leaving your paycheck before you see it. It left last Friday. It will leave again 2 Fridays from now. The most remarkable part of the whole arrangement isn't that it happens. It's that you've been paying for it your entire life. And this might be the first time you've ever stopped to wonder why. If this changed how you see the number at the bottom of your pay stub, consider subscribing. There are more invisible systems to uncover.